When people think of Nazi concentration camps, names like Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Bergen-Belsen often come first to mind. But there was another camp built with geometric precision and ideological purpose that stood just north of Berlin, a model of Nazi efficiency and cruelty. Its name was Sachsenhausen. The story of Sachsenhausen is the story of how terror was engineered, managed, and normalized. It is the story of how the Nazi regime transformed a quiet town into a laboratory of oppression. It is also the story of how, even in the darkest conditions, the human spirit refused to be completely extinguished. To understand Sachsenhausen, we must go back to Germany in the mid-1930s, a nation still recovering from the humiliation of the First World War and the instability that followed. By 1933, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party had seized power. Within months, democracy was dismantled, and the machinery of total control began to take shape. Political opponents were silenced, dissenting voices jailed, and minorities targeted through propaganda and new laws. The Nazi state needed more than prisons. It needed places where ideology could be enforced through fear and labor, where undesirables could disappear. The first of these camps, Dachau, opened in 1933 near Munich. It became a prototype for the network that would later span Europe. By 1936, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, decided that a new, more sophisticated camp was needed, one close to the capital, Berlin, that could serve as both a functioning prison and a training ground for SS officers. Construction of Sachsenhausen began that summer. The town chosen was Oranienburg, a modest suburb roughly 35 kilometers north of Berlin. Its proximity to the seat of government was deliberate. SS leaders wanted officials, visitors, and trainees to see what efficient repression looked like. The camp's design reflected this ideology. Unlike the haphazard layouts of earlier sites, Sachsenhausen was built as a triangle radiating outward from a central watchtower. From that tower, guards could observe every barrack, every path, every roll call square. The shape allowed machine gun fire to sweep across the entire prisoner area without blind spots. Geometry became a weapon. Order became terror. The first inmates who arrived in 1936 were mostly German political prisoners, communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. Later, as the regime expanded its persecution, the population diversified. Jews, Roma, and Sinti people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and anyone labelled a social or criminal. These terms were deliberately vague. They allowed the SS to imprison almost anyone without legal process. From the moment of arrival, the process was one of dehumanization. Prisoners were stripped of belongings, shaved, disinfected, and issued striped uniforms. Names were replaced with numbers. Families were torn apart. The first lesson every prisoner learned was that individuality was dangerous. The daily routine was a ritual of domination. Before dawn, the sirens would wail. Prisoners had to rush outside for roll call, standing motionless for hours regardless of weather. SS guards patrolled the rows, barking orders, striking at anyone who stumbled. After roll call, work assignments were announced. The camp motto displayed above the gate declared, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. In reality, work was another form of punishment. Some prisoners were forced to labour in the camp's workshops, shoemaking, tailoring, carpentry, or printing. Others were sent to the nearby brickworks, a site infamous for exhaustion and death. They carried heavy loads, pushed carts of clay, and endured beatings for the slightest mistake. The quarry, known as the killing ground, claimed hundreds of lives each year. Food rations were pitiful: thin soup, a scrap of bread, sometimes a sliver of margarine. Malnutrition and disease spread quickly. Lice and fleas infested barracks. The infirmary, ironically called the Revier, offered little care. Doctors were often SS men conducting experiments rather than providing treatment. Sachsenhausen was not merely a detention centre, it was a training ground. SS recruits learned here how to command, punish, and kill. They practiced drills of obedience and cruelty. Graduates of Sachsenhausen went on to serve in other camps, spreading its methods across occupied Europe. In 1938, the camp expanded dramatically after the so-called Kristallnacht pogrom, when Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were destroyed across Germany. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to Sachsenhausen. The influx overwhelmed the camp. Barracks overflowed and beatings became daily routine. Many of those Jews were released weeks later, but only after signing over property or agreeing to emigrate. The camp thus became a tool of both terror and extortion. When war erupted in 1939, Sachsenhausen entered a new phase. The Nazis no longer needed to conceal their brutality. They needed labor to fuel the war economy and an efficient system to eliminate enemies. The camp's industries expanded. A shoe-testing track was built, where prisoners were forced to march for days in circles to test new military footwear. Others worked in counterfeit operations, printing British currency as part of Operation Bernhard, one of the largest counterfeiting schemes in history. In 1941, a new group arrived, Soviet prisoners of war. Nazi ideology regarded them as subhuman, unworthy of life. Thousands were executed within months. The SS constructed a secret facility known as Station Z, a euphemism meaning the last station. There, prisoners were shot, hanged, or gassed in small-scale experiments using Zyklon B, the same chemical later deployed at Auschwitz. Station Z embodied the industrial logic of mass murder. Victims were led through a series of rooms, first told they were receiving medical checks or showers, then killed, their bodies burned in nearby ovens. Efficiency was prized over humanity. By 1942, Sachsenhausen held more than 40,000 prisoners. The camp population became increasingly international as the Nazi Empire expanded. Resistance fighters from France, Norway, and the Netherlands, Polish intellectuals, Spanish Republicans who had fled Franco, and later captured members of the Red Army. Each group brought its own networks of solidarity. Amid despair, prisoners taught each other languages, shared scraps of food, and organized clandestine cultural life, small gestures of defiance that preserved identity. As the war dragged on, conditions worsened. Food shortages grew severe. Typhus and dysentery spread. Punishments became ever more sadistic. Prisoners were flogged for trivial offences, forced to perform sport, exhausting physical exercises designed to break them, or executed publicly as warnings. The roll call square became both stage and graveyard. Among the prisoners were several prominent individuals: Martin Niemöller, the Protestant pastor who had opposed Nazi interference in the church, Georg Elser, who had attempted to assassinate Hitler, and foreign politicians used as hostages. For these men, imprisonment was also a propaganda tool. The SS showcased them as proof that no one was beyond its reach. By 1943, Sachsenhausen had become an entire complex of horror. Its influence stretched far beyond the main triangular camp. Surrounding it were dozens of subcamps, each attached to war industries and SS enterprises. The prisoners, numbering in the tens of thousands, were the backbone of this forced labour economy. Factories were built around the camp's perimeter. Workshops produced uniforms, boots, and military equipment. Prisoners repaired engines, assembled weapons, and constructed buildings for the German army. The SS profited enormously, charging private companies for the labour of those who were never paid and seldom survived long enough to see their work completed. The irony was cruel. Even as Nazi ideology declared these prisoners inferior, the regime relied on their labour. The hands that built the tools of war were often those marked for extermination. The prisoners' lives were reduced to calculations: calories against productivity, exhaustion against output. If a prisoner collapsed, there was always another to replace him. For the SS, human beings were a resource to be consumed. The cruelty extended beyond physical labour. Sachsenhausen was a laboratory for ideological domination. The SS believed they could reprogram prisoners through humiliation and terror. Roll calls could last for hours, in rain or snow, as punishment for minor infractions or escape attempts. The bodies of executed prisoners were sometimes left hanging in view of others, a grim reminder of the price of disobedience. Medical experiments continued. Inmates were subjected to tests on vaccines, chemical burns, and freezing conditions. Many died, and those who survived were left permanently scarred. The doctors who conducted these experiments often justified their actions as scientific research, a perverse distortion of medicine in service of ideology. Sachsenhausen was also the site of executions by shooting, hanging, and lethal injection. Political prisoners from across occupied Europe were brought here to die in secrecy. In 1944, the Nazis executed thousands of Soviet prisoners, Polish resistance members, and captured Allied agents. The camp's crematoriums burned day and night. Despite the constant threat of death, resistance persisted. Prisoners organized covert networks, sharing news from the outside world and smuggling notes to families. They sabotaged production lines, damaged machinery, and forged papers. Some SS men sympathetic to prisoners took enormous risks to pass messages or delay executions. Acts of humanity, however small, became weapons of moral resistance. Among the prisoners were artists, writers, and intellectuals who tried to preserve culture within the camp. They held secret lectures, recited poetry, and even performed small plays when guards weren't watching. These fragile moments of creativity were acts of defiance, reminders that thought and spirit could survive even in the machinery of terror. By late 1944, the war was turning decisively against Germany. Allied bombing raids had reached Berlin. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. The SS began preparing for defeat, but not by releasing prisoners. Instead, they intensified their efforts to hide evidence. Documents were burned, facilities dismantled, and witnesses silenced. The number of deaths rose sharply in the camp's final months. Food supplies dwindled as transport lines collapsed. Barracks meant for 150 people now held over 400. Starvation, disease, and despair consumed the camp. Typhus raged unchecked. Corpses piled up faster than they could be cremated. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, the SS issued orders to evacuate the camp. On April 20th, 1945, Adolf Hitler's birthday, the Guards began marching more than 30,000 prisoners away from Sachsenhausen toward the north and west, away from the advancing Red Army. These death marches were among the most brutal chapters of the entire war. Prisoners, already weak and starving, were forced to walk for days without food or rest. Anyone who stumbled or fell behind was shot. Entire columns of exhausted men and women collapsed along the roadsides. Civilians who witnessed the marches often looked away, too afraid to intervene. Others quietly offered water or bread, risking execution themselves. The death marches turned the German countryside into a moving graveyard. Survivors later recalled the endless lines of bodies along the roads, the silence broken only by gunshots and the cries of those too weak to continue. On April 22, 1945, Soviet and Polish forces reached Sachsenhausen. What they found was a nightmare made real. The SS had fled, leaving behind thousands of sick and dying prisoners who could no longer move. Emaciated figures stumbled out of barracks, blinded by sunlight, unsure whether liberation was real or another deception. The liberators discovered mass graves, piles of ash, and evidence of systematic murder. They found the ruins of Station Z, the crematorium, and documents detailing executions and experiments. Soviet photographers captured scenes of unimaginable suffering, images that would later be used in war crimes trials. For the survivors, liberation was not the end of suffering. Many were too weak to stand. Diseases like typhus and dysentery continued to claim lives even after the SS were gone. The Red Army established emergency hospitals, but the human cost was beyond comprehension. Out of more than 200,000 people who had passed through Sachsenhausen between 1936 and 1945, tens of thousands were dead. Some estimates place the number between 40,000 and 60,000. Families waited years, sometimes decades, to learn what had happened to their loved ones. In many cases, they never did. Sachsenhausen became one of the many places in Europe where absence itself was the memorial, a void left by those who never returned. But Sachsenhausen's story did not end in 1945. In a cruel twist of fate, the camp continued to function, this time under new management. The Soviet NKVD, the secret police, took control of the site and repurposed it as special camp number 7. Between 1945 and 1950, the Soviets imprisoned more than 60,000 people there, including former Nazis, suspected collaborators, and political opponents. Conditions were again horrific. Overcrowding, starvation, and disease claimed the lives of thousands. Historians estimate that at least 12,000 people died in the Soviet camp. For many Germans, this period complicated the memory of Sachsenhausen. The same barracks that had once held victims of Nazi terror now held new prisoners under Soviet authority. The site became a mirror of shifting power, a place where totalitarian regimes, one after another, turned ideology into suffering. When the Soviet camp closed in 1950, the site was left abandoned. Grass grew over the roll call square. Watchtowers crumbled. The ruins of Station Z stood as mute witnesses to the crimes of both regimes. Only later did East Germany begin to confront the site's meaning. In 1961, the East German government opened the Sachsenhausen National Memorial, but in the Cold War climate, the memorial emphasized the suffering of communist resistance fighters, while largely downplaying the persecution of Jews, homosexuals, and others. Memory itself had become political. Survivors continued to return, giving testimony and demanding broader recognition. Their stories challenged the official narratives and insisted on a more complete remembrance. After German reunification in 1990, the memorial was restructured to reflect the full history of the camp, both under Nazi and Soviet rule. New museums, exhibitions, and archives opened, preserving documents and personal artifacts. Today, Sachsenhausen stands as a place of learning and mourning. Visitors walk through reconstructed barracks, past the remnants of crematoria and guard towers. School groups gather in silence around memorial stones. The air carries a heavy stillness, as if the ground itself remembers. The camp's design, once praised by the SS for its order, now stands as an indictment. The triangle that symbolized control now symbolizes loss. The central watchtower that once surveyed prisoners now overlooks a space dedicated to remembrance. The question that echoes through Sachsenhausen is the same one that haunts all Holocaust sites. How could this happen? How could ordinary men and women participate in or ignore such cruelty? Part of the answer lies in the banality of evil, the phrase coined by philosopher Hannah Arendt, who observed the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the organizers of the Holocaust. Arendt noted that the machinery of genocide was not powered solely by monsters, but by bureaucrats, officers, and citizens who followed orders, obeyed ideology, and failed to question. Sachsenhausen was built and maintained by such people. Architects drew the plans, engineers built the walls, clerks kept records, SS officers administered orders. Each piece of the system functioned with mechanical precision, and together they created a machine of death. The warning that Sachsenhausen carries is therefore not only about the past, it is about what happens when obedience replaces conscience, when ideology replaces empathy, and when people surrender moral responsibility to authority. The camp's survivors understood this better than anyone. Many spent their post-war lives telling their stories in schools, writing memoirs, and standing before young audiences to ensure that memory did not fade. Their testimonies are among the most powerful tools against denial and indifference. In one such testimony, a survivor described standing in roll call at dawn, watching the frost glisten on barbed wire, hearing the boots of guards crunching in the snow, and realizing that survival itself had become an act of rebellion. Every breath, every heartbeat was defiance. Even after decades, many could still recall the sounds, the whistle for roll call, the barked orders, the clang of gates. Memory does not fade easily when it is carved into the mind by fear and loss. Sachsenhausen is not just a monument to death. It is a monument to survival, to endurance, and to the necessity of remembrance. Each visitor who walks its grounds, each student who learns its history, becomes part of that act of remembrance. After the war ended and the fires of the crematoria were extinguished, the world faced an unbearable question: how to comprehend what had been done. For those who had survived Sachsenhausen, the answer was not simple. Liberation did not mean peace. It meant learning to live again after years in a world where compassion had been outlawed. In displaced persons camps across Europe, survivors from Sachsenhausen tried to rebuild their strength. Many were skeletal, sick with typhus or tuberculosis, and haunted by nightmares. Some never recovered their families. Husbands searched for wives, parents for children, friends for faces that no longer appeared on any list. The emotional distance between survivors and the world around them could be vast. How could anyone who had never seen the camp truly understand what it meant to live in its shadow? Yet out of that silence, testimonies began to emerge. Survivors wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and stood before courts to identify their captors. In the early post-war years, these voices were fragile, often doubted or ignored. The world, eager to rebuild, sometimes turned away from their pain. But the survivors persisted, insisting that the story be told, not for revenge, but for truth. In 1946 and 1947, the Allied powers held the Nuremberg trials to prosecute major Nazi officials. Evidence from Sachsenhausen formed part of the record. Witnesses described the executions at Station Z, the beatings, the starvation, and the endless roll calls. Photographs and documents from the camp were presented in court. Later, the Soviet Union held its own Sachsenhausen trial in Berlin, convicting several former SS officers of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Justice, however, was incomplete. Thousands of guards and functionaries melted back into society, hidden among millions of displaced people. Some resumed ordinary lives, never facing accountability. The machinery of genocide had been vast, and the courts could punish only a fraction of its operators. For survivors, justice took other forms. Telling their stories became an act of resistance against forgetting. The writer Eugen Kogon, who had studied the camp system, called this moral duty the struggle for truth. Every recollection, every testimony was a way to reclaim humanity from the void that Sachsenhausen had tried to create. Through the 1950s, the memory of Sachsenhausen remained divided by the new political border that split Germany. Oranienburg fell within the German Democratic Republic, the Communist East. There, the government framed the camp's history largely through an anti-fascist lens, emphasizing the heroism of communist prisoners while minimizing the experiences of Jews, Roma, and other groups. In West Germany, where economic recovery took precedence, many preferred to look forward rather than backward. Only a few writers and educators spoke openly about the crimes of the camps. Still, memory has a way of seeping through cracks. Former inmates formed associations, published newsletters, and visited schools. Slowly, a broader picture of the camp's reality re-emerged. By the early 1960s, with the Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem and the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in West Germany, public awareness of the Holocaust deepened. Survivors from Sachsenhausen gave testimony once more, their voices steadier, their stories now impossible to ignore. In 1961, East Germany inaugurated the Sachsenhausen National Memorial, built partly on the ruins of the old camp. Granite monuments, solemn sculptures, and a massive obelisk rose where barracks once stood. It was a place of ceremony and ideology, a socialist shrine that honoured resistance fighters and condemned fascism, but that still left other victims in the shadows. Nevertheless, for many visitors, the memorial was their first confrontation with the physical reality of a concentration camp. The grey walls and wide empty spaces spoke more powerfully than any speech. Meanwhile, in the West, historians began documenting the camp system with greater rigour. The word Sachsenhausen entered textbooks and court records, symbolising the bureaucratic precision of Nazi cruelty. Researchers uncovered the camp's role as a training centre for SS officers who later administered Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek. The blueprints of the camp, once symbols of order, became evidence of calculated evil. As the decades passed, survivors aged, and the urgency of memory grew. Many returned to Sachsenhausen for commemorations, walking once more through the gates that had once promised, "Work sets you free." They brought their children and grandchildren, hoping that first-hand memory might plant seeds of empathy in new generations. Their presence transformed the site from a place of terror into a place of warning. The camp also became a focus of artistic reflection. Writers, filmmakers, and sculptors grappled with its meaning. Some works captured the grey monotony of camp life, others the brief flashes of solidarity that kept people alive. Art became another form of testimony, bridging the gap between experience and comprehension. By the 1990s, after German reunification, historians began re-examining the entire history of Sachsenhausen, including its years as a Soviet detention centre. Newly opened archives revealed a continuity of suffering, hunger, disease, arbitrary imprisonment. The discovery challenged simplistic narratives of liberation and forced Germans to confront uncomfortable truths, that even the victors could commit injustices on the same soil where the Nazis had reigned. This period also brought a new approach to memorial culture. Instead of grand monuments alone, curators emphasized authenticity, the surviving walls, the original foundations, the fragments of barracks. Exhibitions focused on individual stories rather than abstract numbers. Visitors could read letters smuggled from the camp, see the tools of forced labour, or listen to recorded voices of survivors describing the smell of the kitchens, the cold of the mornings, the constant fear. Educational programs flourished. Teachers brought students to Sachsenhausen not simply to learn dates and statistics, but to experience empathy and moral reflection. Standing in the roll call square, one could feel the weight of silence, the vast emptiness where thousands once stood at attention. Such encounters left lasting impressions. They turned history from something distant into something personal. In modern Germany, remembrance of Sachsenhausen became part of a national responsibility known as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. This process demanded honesty, self-examination, and acknowledgement that remembrance must be active, not ceremonial. The site became a touchstone for discussions about democracy, human rights, and the dangers of ideology. Yet remembrance also evolved globally. Survivors from across Europe, Israel, and the Americas connected their experiences in Sachsenhausen to the wider narrative of the Holocaust. Historians traced how the camp's SS personnel had spread their methods elsewhere, turning a single location into a symbol of an entire system. Exhibitions travelled abroad. Museums in Washington, London, and Jerusalem displayed artifacts from Sachsenhausen to remind the world that genocide begins with prejudice, not with gas chambers. The digital age brought new ways to remember. Online archives now hold photographs, testimonies, and documents accessible to anyone with a computer. Virtual tours allow people who may never travel to Germany to walk the camp's paths, read the inscriptions, and hear the voices of survivors. Technology, once used for control and surveillance, now serves memory and education. But as the last witnesses pass away, the burden of memory shifts to us. Without living testimony, the risk of distortion grows. Denial and revisionism creep into discourse, cloaked in pseudo-academic language. At such times, Sachsenhausen's preserved ruins become more than historical relics. They are the physical proof against forgetting. For survivors, remembrance was never about revenge. It was about warning. They knew how easily fear and propaganda could corrode morality. They had seen neighbors turn away, teachers repeat lies, bureaucrats follow orders that led to death. They understood that genocide does not begin with camps. It begins with words, with indifference, with the idea that some lives are worth less than others. Sachsenhausen, therefore, is not only a cemetery of the past, but a mirror for the present. When visitors ask how ordinary people could have participated, the answer lies partly in the ordinary nature of the perpetrators. They were clerks, guards, and officers who believed they were doing their duty. They compartmentalized their conscience. They obeyed authority, and in that obedience they became instruments of evil. To walk through Sachsenhausen today is to confront that potential within humanity. The camp forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What would I have done? How does society guard against such cruelty? How fragile are the structures that protect our rights and freedoms? These questions have no final answers, but they are the essence of remembrance. The lessons of Sachsenhausen reach beyond the borders of Germany. Around the world, new camps, new prisons, and new ideologies continue to dehumanize. Each generation must decide whether history will be repeated or remembered. The memorial's quiet grounds remind us that vigilance is not a burden. It is a duty inherited from those who could no longer speak. In recent decades, archaeologists have unearthed forgotten foundations of the camp's extensions, uncovering fragments of utensils, identity tags, and bits of barbed wire. Each discovery rehumanizes the victims. Behind every artifact lies a life story interrupted but not erased. Museums now catalogue these items not as curiosities, but as voices. A spoon bent from overuse, a scrap of uniform, a penciled note on stolen paper. Each tells more than statistics ever could. Annual commemorations continue to be held every April, marking the liberation. Survivors who can still travel arrive in wheelchairs or with canes, accompanied by families and school children. Wreaths are laid, names are read aloud, and silence follows, a silence deeper than words. Politicians speak of responsibility, but the most powerful moments come when a survivor simply says, "Remember what we saw here. It began with hate. It can begin again if you let it." As the sun sets over the memorial, the shadows of the watchtowers stretch across the ground. The geometry that once symbolized control now frames emptiness and sky. Birds nest in the rafters of the barracks. The place has grown quiet, but it is not at peace. It demands remembrance. The historian who studies Sachsenhausen must grapple with moral as well as factual questions. Numbers matter, tens of thousands murdered, but behind each number lies a human being whose laughter, language, and dreams were stolen. To reduce them to statistics is to repeat, in miniature, the dehumanization that the camp enforced. Thus, to tell this story fully is to restore names, faces, and individuality wherever possible. The story of Sachsenhausen ends not in silence, but in the living echo of remembrance. The camp itself no longer imprisons anyone, yet it still holds the world's attention. Its fences stand as lines between cruelty and conscience, between what humanity became and what it must never become again. When visitors arrive at the memorial today, they often describe a strange stillness. The triangular layout remains visible, though many barracks are gone. The roll call square stretches wide and empty. The old watchtower, once the centre of surveillance, now houses an exhibition on SS ideology. The gate with its iron slogan, Arbeit macht frei, has been restored not as an emblem but as evidence, proof of how deceit and propaganda cloaked murder in the language of work and order. Guides tell stories not of statistics but of people. They speak of the Polish priest who smuggled letters to families, of the French doctor who risked his life to treat fellow inmates, of the young Jewish boy from Berlin who carved a Star of David into the wood of his bunk. These stories anchor history in humanity. Each one breaks the anonymity the SS tried to impose. Outside the camp walls lies the small town of Oranienburg. Its streets are quiet, its houses ordinary. Children play, commuters take trains to Berlin. Life goes on, as it always does. Yet for those who know the history, every passing train whistle sounds faintly like the ones that once brought prisoners here. Memory and normalcy coexist, uneasy but inseparable. Historians continue to study the camp's administration, tracing documents that reveal how decisions of life and death were made on paper, with signatures and stamps. Bureaucracy, they remind us, was the true language of the Holocaust. The killing did not begin with rage. It began with forms, files, and meetings. The perpetrators did not see victims. They saw numbers to be processed. That recognition has shaped the moral reflection of post-war Germany. In schools, students learn not only about the crimes, but about the mechanisms that enabled them, the propaganda, the legal decrees, the silence of bystanders. Sachsenhausen's archives serve as teaching tools for democracy itself. To understand how a state turned against its citizens is to learn how to defend a state that protects them. Survivors often expressed ambivalence about returning. Some said they felt ghosts in every corner. Others said they needed to return so that the ghosts would not be alone. Standing before the ruins of Station Z, one survivor whispered, "This was the end of the road, but not the end of our story." That sentiment captures the essence of remembrance. The dead cannot speak, yet their message endures through those who choose to remember. Memorial culture has evolved over time. In recent decades, curators have focused on authenticity, preserving the physical evidence rather than replacing it with monuments. The cracked concrete, the rusted wires, the remnants of ovens all speak more clearly than stone statues. Exhibits use testimonies in many languages, acknowledging that the camp's victims came from across Europe and that suffering knew no national boundary. Scholars debate how to balance commemoration and education. Some argue that the site should remain untouched, a silent witness. Others believe it should actively teach new generations about racism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarianism in the modern world. Both views share one goal: to ensure that Sachsenhausen remains a warning, not a relic. Each April, on the anniversary of liberation, ceremonies bring together survivors, their descendants, and representatives of dozens of nations. Flags that once symbolized division now hang side by side. Candles line the roll call square. As darkness falls, the flames flicker against the old walls, casting shifting shadows like the ones that once fell from searchlights. In that light, remembrance becomes a collective act, a vow that what was done here will never be forgotten. The moral legacy of Sachsenhausen extends beyond history. It challenges every society that faces the temptation of dehumanization. When political rhetoric divides people into insiders and outsiders, when fear is used to justify cruelty, the echoes of the camp return. The mechanisms of oppression rarely announce themselves as evil. They appear first as efficiency, security, or purity. Sachsenhausen reminds us to question such language wherever it arises. For Germany, the process of confronting this past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, has become a cornerstone of its democratic identity. To remember Sachsenhausen is not to dwell in guilt, but to affirm responsibility, the responsibility to defend human dignity, to protect minorities, to uphold truth. Memory is not a burden to be carried, but a compass to be followed. Across the world, other nations have drawn their own lessons. Museums and educational programs use Sachsenhausen's story to teach about genocide prevention, civil courage, and the defense of human rights. The camp's archives are cited in studies of transitional justice, ethics, and political psychology. Its geometry of terror has become a geometry of warning, a blueprint inverted into conscience. For the descendants of survivors, remembrance is deeply personal. Many grew up hearing fragments of stories told late at night in whispers. Visiting the camp, they piece together those fragments, finding the places their parents once described: the gate, the barracks, the roll call square. Some leave stones or notes at the memorials. Others simply stand in silence. In their presence, the chain of memory remains unbroken. Artists continue to respond to Sachsenhausen through poetry, film, and music. Some works explore the emptiness of the site, others transform the silence into sound. Composers have written requiems using the names of victims as lyrics, turning loss into lamentation. Painters depict the camp not as ruins, but as spaces of absence, a landscape where memory itself becomes visible. These creative acts ensure that remembrance does not ossify into ritual. They keep emotion alive where routine might dull it. Art, like testimony, resists the erosion of empathy. Visitors often ask what they should feel after seeing Sachsenhausen. There is no prescribed emotion. Grief, anger, disbelief, or quiet reflection, all are appropriate. The important thing is to feel something, because indifference is the soil in which cruelty grows. The philosopher Theodor Adorno once said that to write poetry after Auschwitz was barbaric, yet he later revised his statement, acknowledging that only through expression could humanity confront what had happened. The same holds true for Sachsenhausen. Words may never be adequate, but silence would be worse. As the last survivors pass away, their recorded testimonies become our inheritance. They tell of hunger so severe that imagination itself shrank, of comradeship that gave meaning to survival, of moral choices made in impossible circumstances. Listening to them is not an act of pity, but of respect. Their endurance grants us the chance to learn. In recent years, scholars have also turned attention to those who resisted within the camp. The clandestine networks that gathered information, the acts of sabotage that slowed production, the secret education classes where prisoners taught each other languages and history. These stories reveal that even in total domination, resistance was possible. The human will to assert dignity could not be erased. Sachsenhausen thus embodies both extremes of humanity, the depths of cruelty and the spark of conscience. Its history forces us to recognize that the line between the two is thinner than we might wish. The same society that produced poets and philosophers also produced guards who believed obedience outweighed morality. Remembering this tension is essential because it reminds us that civilization is fragile. When the day ends and visitors leave, the memorial returns to quiet. The air cools, the trees rustle beyond the fences, and the last light fades over the parade ground. Nothing moves, yet everything speaks. The gravel paths, the rusted rails, the faint smell of earth, they carry echoes of footsteps long gone. To walk away from Sachsenhausen is to carry those echoes within you. They become part of the conscience that travels with every person who has seen the evidence of what human beings can do to one another. They whisper reminders in moments of intolerance, in careless words, in the temptation to look away. In that sense, Sachsenhausen has achieved a paradoxical victory. It was built to erase humanity, but today it sustains humanity's moral memory. The camp failed in its ultimate goal because its victims are remembered not as numbers but as people. Their suffering teaches empathy. Their endurance teaches courage. The final lesson of Sachsenhausen is simple yet immense. History is not inevitable. Tyranny grows when people stop asking questions, when fear silences compassion, when truth is sacrificed to ideology. The barbed wire may have rusted away, but the capacity for cruelty remains. So does the capacity for resistance. Which side prevails depends on the choices we make every day. Standing before the gate one last time, you might notice that the iron letters of Arbeit macht frei are thin, almost fragile. They were meant to project strength, yet time has corroded them. They no longer command, they accuse. Beyond them lies the open field of the memorial, where the voices of the dead seem to mingle with the wind. Listen closely, and you may hear what they have been saying for decades. Remember us. Do not let it happen again. Sachsenhausen is no longer a place of power, it is a place of conscience. Its geometry remains, but its purpose has been transformed. What was once designed to control now invites reflection. What was built to destroy now demands humanity. The story ends here, but remembrance does not. As long as one person stands before these ruins and remembers, the victims of Sachsenhausen are not lost to time. Their memory endures, in stone, in testimony, and in the moral awareness of all who listen. Never forget, never again. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear and remember these stories.